The great 19th century journalist and minor novelist Charles Dickens wrote, "It was the best of times and it was the worst of times." He might have been referring to the state of journalism today. If you're a consumer of journalism, it's the best of times. Credible, reliable news and writing and film and documentaries are all only a click away. If you're a reporter in a newsroom, a shrinking newsroom, or a legacy media proprietor, it might be the worst of times, or uncertain times at best. When Judith Neilson asked me to help her establish a journalism institute, I embarked on a 4-month global tour of newsrooms, journalism schools and centres, startups, philanthropic media initiatives and Silicon Valley. I spoke to more than 100 media owners, editors, journalists across a broad spectrum of media in Europe, the US, Asia and here at home. I read dozens of learned studies and articles, all pondering the future of journalism. At the end of it all, I reached the conclusion that I think all of us are coming to, and we heard this come through in the panel discussion just now. That is, that while we are certainly in the midst of massive disruption, there are reasons to be optimistic about the future of journalism. People still want the news, and there are increasing signs they are willing to pay for it, and pay for quality. They want great stories told well, in new and interesting ways that we couldn't conceive of just a few years ago. And despite the roiling churn and chatter of social media, we still rely on traditional sources for information that we can trust. Journalists are, by and large, romantics. We love the folklore and tradition of journalism that has inspired the profession or the vocation for the past 200 years or so. I'm as guilty as overdosing on nostalgia as the next journo. Just last week, I read a wonderful speech given a few years ago by Mike Coward, best known as a cricket writer, but mostly he's just a great journalist. The stories in his speech chimed with me because he was describing the papers that I first worked on as a work experience kid at the Adelaide News, an afternoon paper that published 4 editions every day. 4 editions for an afternoon paper in Adelaide. And the Advertiser, where I was a copy boy, still put to bed each night with the same linotype machines and presses that had been rolling for a century or more. And then I was on to the Sun News Pictorial in Flinders Street, Melbourne, a newspaper fortress that Mike reminded me turned out 1.1 million papers a day. 1.1 million copies of the Sun and the Herald every day. Incredible. Those days are, however, gone, and they ain't coming back. But new and exciting days for journalism are ahead. We often hear that the old business model of journalism is dead. But we are now seeing new and interesting models emerging. And while the future of the business overall is not settled, in all likelihood, we will continue to see a whole range of hybrid models, various combinations of commercial, not-for-profit, community-backed initiatives, philanthropy. All of these will probably make up the journalism landscape of the future. That's where the Judith Neilson Institute hopes to play a role. We have a simple mission: to encourage and celebrate quality journalism. Of course, we can't do everything, and we know that our role will evolve and change in the years ahead. We fundamentally believe that the ultimate goal is to get people to pay for quality content. But on the way towards that goal, we believe the best way to support journalism is to help get more of it done. Do more of it and do it better. This aim has guided the first of our collaborative projects, a series with The Australian about China that we hope will complicate and enrich that enormously important story as it unfolds in the decades ahead. We're helping The Guardian publish more reporting on the Pacific, and the AFR is reopening its Jakarta bureau with our help. Nine is hiring 2 Indigenous journalists to work on a series on Indigenous issues to be published in the SMH and The Age. We are helping with other smaller projects in remote communities, and like everyone else, as you've just heard, we're helping with a podcast. These kinds of collaborations will be ongoing as we take time over the next year or two to consider larger signature projects that we hope can make a real and lasting impact on journalism. I don't want to waste this opportunity to make some observations about Australian journalism right now. Since I left journalism proper more than 30 years ago, I have been around and about it as a press secretary, heading up a government media unit, and from the commanding heights of a Prime Minister's office and later a global corporation. I feel as though I've seen journalism in the round, as it were. But for the past 18 months, I've been totally immersed in it again, and I'm seeing it with fresh eyes. One of the most striking features I've noticed about Australian journalism is how fractious it's become, how combative and mean-spirited. Some might say even self-obsessed. And please be aware that I'm generalising here to make a point. The collegiality that existed when I started out, even among the fiercest competitors, seems to have leached away. Like society at large, journalism has formed tribes, and each tribe has its spear carrier. These spear carriers are too quick to point out a competitor's unforced error, or too slow to judge that mistake against a career's worth of diligent and accurate reporting. Too slow to give a colleague or a rival organisation the benefit of the doubt. The relentless sniping between media organisations has become tiresome, and the sniping goes both ways, I know, between what is called the left and the right, as if those terms mean anything anymore. But do the readers or the viewers really care? ScoMo might have his Canberra bubble, but I reckon journos have created a pretty good bubble of their own. Much of the criticism that gets tossed back and forth within the bubble is merely a reminder that we live in a pretty healthy democracy. Mostly, we all get to say and write what we think. But a lot of the heated and mostly petty carping is of little interest to a wider audience. I happen to believe, somewhat unfashionably, as I've discovered in some quarters, that News Corporation is good for journalism. Do I agree with everything news does or says? Of course not. But look at the body of work. Look at the great journalism, the great editors and reporters whose careers have been born and sustained under news mastheads over the past 60 years or so. Journalism needs to be a broad church. It is made up of all types, and it must take all types if it is to serve its audience and serve our democracy. I'm not a regular viewer of Sky After Dark. But to Andrew, Paul, Chris, and all the others there, I say, knock yourselves out. I also happen to think that Lenore Taylor at The Guardian is one of the most talented and committed editors anywhere. She and her team generate great journalism that people are paying for. But I don't rely on The Guardian alone for sustenance. And while I occasionally question why the ABC made this or that editorial decision, I remind myself of the scale of what that organisation does every day, and that it is bound to misstep from time to time. But in the end, even the ABC's most vocal critics must concede that it consistently produces indispensable first-class journalism. A journalist I admire greatly once said this better than I can. He said, "Quality journalism is grounded in facts, while abounding in disagreements. So by all means, let's go on having disagreements, and let's make it as robust as possible within the bounds of civil debate. But let's not continue with the infantile notion that one media organisation or another is all good or all bad. We all know it's more complicated and more subtle than that. This is why JNI, the Judith Neilson Institute, will work with all media players where we think we can do some good. We'll work with commercial players trying to make journalism pay, and we'll try to lend a hand in places where it will always be hard to turn a profit. But above all, we will help journalists spend more time chasing the story, because ultimately that's what really matters. And there are more stories out there than ever. For one thing, technology, the devil that disrupted journalism, is opening up vast new mines of information that can be turned into amazing stories. What comes next for journalism is an open question, but we can be pretty sure that most of the bold predictions won't pan out. They rarely do. That's why JNI is spreading the risk, as it were, positioning ourselves in the midst of all this change and hoping to move with it. I was asked to talk about why journalism is more important than ever. Of course it's important, but not only because of Trump or Brexit or because democracy around the world is under threat. It's important because humans have an insatiable hunger for great stories well told. Whether they're told by News Corp or The Guardian or a talented freelancer or a filmmaker or a tabloid sub-editor who comes up with a killer headline, they all add up to a great future for journalism. I'll close my remarks with a quote with which I wholeheartedly agree. It comes from Kyle Pope, who happens to serve on JNI's International Advisory Council. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Columbia Journalism Review. He wrote recently, "Clearly, journalism faces daunting, even epic challenges in the way it is financed and distributed, and in the expectations and habits of a new generation of readers. But we see this as a pivotal transition between the journalism that was and the one that will be. The Judith Neilson Institute sees the future exactly the same way." Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.